Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I know it was a cold, awful day out there. I know there were lots of other events going on, probably good books and fireplaces, but we really thank you for coming to what we have planned as a very exciting, a very vital, and a very timely program. And in case you're confused about where you are, this is the U.S. role on the global stage, something none of us have been talking about beyond this group, or so it would seem. We tried our darndest for 8 or 9 months to get the candidates to come and talk about these critical, unavoidable issues that are going to mark their presidency, going to mark the next administration. We're all passionate about the need to have this conversation, and we're very eager to engage as much of the public as well as the candidates prior to the election. So we're hoping you're able to take some of the thoughts that we're going to share with you today to your caucuses that are coming up in about a week's time. And as you may or may not recall, even at the caucuses, while you can talk to the people with you, you can also write out resolutions to ask the Democratic Party to begin to address some of the issues that we're going to be sharing tonight. And to quote a very recent event from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the people who are the managers of the doomsday clock, it was just this week set to 100 seconds to midnight, because things on this globe are not getting better. We have normalized a very dangerous world. The situations with regard to militaries, with regard to nuclear weapons, our physical and social environments are all degrading. And without attention from these candidates or from ourselves, this is a classic issue of when the leaders don't lead. We have to call upon one another to lead, to bring the leaders to the places they don't want to go. So I'm hopeful that each of you will help us in advancing understanding and exploring some potential solutions to find and expand the light, the dim light at the end of a very dark tunnel. So thank you again for coming. To get us started, I want to introduce our moderator for the day, Mr. Ward Wilson, who is a well-known author, historian, and nuclear weapons expert. Ward Wilson is widely acknowledged as a leading source of all things, pragmatic arguments against nuclear weapons in the world today. He has been a senior fellow at a number of influential think tanks, including the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies and the Federation of American Scientists. He is an award-winning writer, and he's been published in not only nuclear journals and military journals like Joint Force Quarterly, and foreign policy journals like Survival, Foreign Policy, and even Harvard's International Security, as well as the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a number of others. He has been invited to speak in 23 countries on 6 continents, at the Pentagon, the French National Assembly, the United Nations, the Scottish National Parliament.
Maureen, it's
and
okay.
He's saying it's enough, and actually I shortened it.
Not that interested.
So anyway, without further ado, I'll let him finish the introduction of himself and start off the program. Thank you again. Thank you, Ward.
Welcome. Welcome. Hello? Is it on?
Turned on.
Okay. So here's how it's going to go. 5 experts will give a brief presentation, followed by 1 or 2 questions. You all have 3x5 cards. And if you are listening to someone and have a question, write that question down. And you might have a chance to ask it. I expect the experts will be fascinating, informed, and brief. The organizing committee has set time limits, and I will enforce those ruthlessly. Please also be brief in your questions. We'll have one candidate's representative here. Senator Bernie Sanders has sent Abshir Omar to give a short presentation and take some questions. He's not here yet, but he will be before we finish. We're live streaming this on PSR Iowa Facebook page. Please share the page. And it's automatically archived, so if you ask a really great question, you can go home and watch yourself asking it again later. This is a cell phone. It makes noise. Please make sure yours doesn't make noise. Thank you. There's a survey online we'd like you to fill out if you're interested. We're going to send the results to candidates. The survey is at www.psriowa.org. And restrooms are through that door. Ready? Okay, let's begin. We begin with Gerald Schnorr. Jerry is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and co-director of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa. He chaired the Iowa Climate Change Advisory Council. It's all you.
Thanks very much, Ward. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this important day and discussion about the U.S. role in international affairs. My part of it has to do with climate change, and I hope you'll ask some good questions to keep our discussion going. As Dr. McHugh said, we're in a crisis. Climate change visits itself in different ways in different places. In Australia, right now, it's wildfires. And last year, with the Paradise Fire, it's wildfires in California as well. If you're on the Miami, Florida, forget about that real estate you were thinking about buying, because there climate change is manifest as clear sky, blue sky, king tide flooding in which they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars and which never occurred before. If you're in New Jersey and New York, you worry about storm surge, the wave tidal action caused during severe storms. And of course, if you're on Grand Bahama Islands and Hurricane Dorian hits, you're worried about 185-mile-per-hour winds, unprecedented, stalling for 40 hours over Abaco Island and Grand Bahama Island. People put their children up on the roof, and along comes a storm surge. 20-foot storm surge just washed them away. If you're in Iowa in the Midwest, it manifests itself as flooding. As you know, intense precipitation events, which we can see very clearly in the meteorological record, which are getting worse and worse. My students and I looked back in Cedar Rapids, Iowa City's record, and it goes back about 130 years. You're hard-pressed to find a day back then of 4-inch rainfall. That's about 100 millimeters. Now, a 4-inch rainfall in a single day in eastern Iowa is not uncommon at all. It's quite common. That's the difference, and when you have that kind of intensity of rainfall, then it manifests itself as flooding, and that's what we're up against. So it is an international problem. We're all in this together. The U.S. has contributed the most emissions historically, and we have the most emissions on a per capita basis. We're also the richest country in the world, most people would say, with the wherewithal to try to respond to this climate change. Is it an emergency? The best estimates that we have of future warming is that it's going to get much worse. These climate catastrophes and climate crises that we're talking about. In fact, we don't have much time. It is indeed an emergency. Within 10 years, we need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions about 45%. In order to build more wind power, more solar power, electric vehicles, new battery technology, in order to have regenerative agriculture and to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into our soils. In order to put all these things into place takes time. We have to start now in order to have those kind of reductions. Yes, it is a climate emergency. All of the speakers today are supposed to address the question, what would we tell the president about our role in these international problems, now climate change? I think I would start with a course that we don't have much time. And we actually had a plan under the Obama administration. I guess I would start there. That plan was to increase to California efficiency standards, our automobile vehicular standards. At the time, all of the major car companies went along with that. We need to reimpose that. We need to put strict controls on our power plants for emission controls, as was previously planned. And of course, under the Obama administration, we were a signatory and a leader, I would say, in the Paris Climate Agreement. Things have gotten worse even since 2015 when that was signed. So it's another indication of the climate emergency, and that we have to redouble our efforts and re-engage with the international community, re-engage our best efforts to try to reduce our emissions. I tell my students, you know, since the Industrial Revolution began in the late 1700s and the steam engine was invented, and we began to burn copious quantities of fossil fuels, coal, I tell them it's been a good run. We clothed ourselves, we housed ourselves, we transported ourselves, we did all our manufacturing on the basis of fossil fuels. In the case of coal, some of which was first laid down 360 million years ago. When you begin to dig up something that took 360 million years to form in the Earth's crust, and you burn it up in just a couple hundred years, of course you're going to change the atmosphere. And we have. And what's really surprising to me is that we, even in my working lifetime, that we've been able to change the oceans. They're about 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer at the surface. We can see the signal going down 2,000 meters into the oceans. The oceans are warmer. That's what's spawning the storms to spin up like Dorian so fast. And the oceans, carbon dioxide, one of the exhausts from our fossil fuels, it's a weak acid. And so we've begun to acidify the oceans, ruin our coral reefs, the very base of the food chain. The oceans, since I began teaching here at the University of Iowa, are about 30% more acidic in terms of hydrogen ion acidity. Imagine that we're changing the entire oceans on Earth. It's time for a change. It's not sustainable. It can't go on, and we have to speak to our president and our elected candidates. We need I can't believe that we still don't have comprehensive energy or climate legislation in our country. We don't have a plan, and we're not engaging with the other countries because we're all in it together. We've done the most, and we're the richest, but the countries that I dealt with during the Paris Climate Agreement, the most vulnerable countries have done the least and are the most affected. It's truly an issue of international climate justice. I'm here to tell you we can do it. There is still time, but we have to act fast. It is an emergency. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse and worse, and I guess we have to conclude it's going to get worse before it gets better. But you know what? In making it better, this is how we're going to create opportunity and jobs for my students at the University of Iowa and all over our country and all over the world. That's how the jobs are going to be created in what's called creative destruction, wiping out the old system, the fossil fuel system, and replacing it with something better, much better. Clear skies, good health, less missed days at work, and yes, a better economy, a better manufacturing economy based on a new system of renewables, energy efficiency, and maybe in the out years, even nuclear. We can talk about that. It certainly won't help us in the next 10 years, however. So that's what I would try to say to the president. I'm interested in what you would try to say to our next president, too. And thank you very much for listening.
Excellent work. Well, that was excellent. And the first question is from Abby Denner. Abby is a junior at the University of Iowa studying international relations and is also a part of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. God, I got that totally wrong.
Hi.
Hi.
So the girl effect is a concept in international development that describes the real, tangible benefits that a community experiences as a result of the investment in the education and health of the women within that community. And data shows that investment in these kinds of things, the skills and labor of women, can result in the reduction of poverty, increases in GDP, and even the betterment of the environment. In fact, in 2017, the Brookings Institute found that for every $1 we invest in family planning and women's services, we would have to invest $4.50 in solar technology in order to see the same carbon reduction. Given these clear benefits to the global environment, how would you advise the president to help women on a global scale in order to mitigate the global climate change?
Wow, that's a great question. It's very clear in the United Nations and the debates, for example, during the Paris Climate Agreement, that education of women is probably the most important thing in terms of improving the human condition, really, our quality of life, our way of life. And I believe that includes living in a way that we don't destroy the planet Earth. You know, sometimes it takes a child. Greta Thunberg was here in Iowa City. Sometimes it takes a child to see the truth. And the fact that we are handing the next generation a messed up planet. They should be angry. They should be very, very angry. And certainly Greta is a woman, and she's a woman who's going to make a difference along the lines that you say. And yes, so we need, as Bernie Sanders says, they need the whole damn dollar, among other things. Women need to be empowered. Internationally, young women need to be educated. And we've made good progress on that, but it can't stop. It has to continue.
The second question is from Arisa Hishikawa. Arisa is studying international relations and is an intern at the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council.
Hello.
Hi.
So with petroleum accounting for over 90% of the total U.S. transportation sector energy, how would you advise the president in going about reducing our total carbon emissions by nearly 50%, the number that you mentioned earlier, as well as accommodate for communities and workers whose jobs depend on fossil fuel?
You mentioned petroleum in particular, right? And petroleum is, the only liquid transportation fuel. Coal, oil, and gas, we need to get out of the business of all three. But petroleum is a transportation fuel issue. So what I would say to the President of the United States is we need to go towards an all-electric vehicle fleet, but that's not good enough as long as we make our power from coal, and we do less so in Iowa and in the United States, but we need to continue that and have our power. We're going to electrify the entire country. We're going to electrify the world, and that power has to be produced in a low carbon way. So the way to get out of petroleum is to make our fleet independent of petroleum, and that would be an electric fleet. But that power has to be produced by wind and solar and hydropower, biomass in Iowa, and yes, even possibly nuclear power in the out years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schnorr. Thank you. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the environment and environmental collapse. And so, Maureen McHugh, that's you.
That's me. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself last time. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Maureen McHugh, and I'm the coordinator for Iowa PSR, and I get so anxious to get things going that I forget to introduce myself, so thank you for your patience and understanding. I wanted to talk about respecting the laws of nature, living as if other living beings mattered, and I appreciate that Professor Schnorr actually kind of introduced you already to that idea, and I hope that you'll see as we go along today, all of these issues intersect with each other. It's really hard to fight one without at least being aware of the others. None of us can fight all these battles, but I think it's important for all of us to recognize the range of things that need to be attended to and at least find something that makes sense for you. And I wanted to start with a quote that I'm not entirely certain which indigenous leader said it, but I know it has been said, and we tend to forget. The earth does not belong to man or mankind. Man belongs to the earth, and we have got to remember that and begin to reassess the ways we have organized our society to take from the earth rather than preserving and restoring the earth. In my own lifetime, and I ask you each to think about this, in my own lifetime, and I'm an old woman, but not that old, the blinking of fireflies, the flitting of the bats at night, the morning chorus of migratory birds that are arriving here in Iowa in the spring from Central and South America, the croaking of the frogs, in fact, the climbing of the frogs on various items throughout the yard, the buzzing and the busy activity of the bees in my garden, the slithering of the snakes along the road. These are the animals, and there are many plants that I know many of you grew up with, and they're all disappearing before our eyes. I often wonder how many of you have noticed you no longer have to clean your windshield every time you go anywhere because the insect population has so dramatically dropped in our lifetime. And you don't have to pick those June bugs out of your hair or down your shirt often as you used to because they're gone as well in many parts of the area. The earth, our only home, is in desperate need of repair. The floor is sinking if you live in Miami. The windows are broken. The roof is leaking. The pipes have burst. Think about western Iowa. And our heat system is totally unreliable. And scientists predict, on top of the predictions we've already heard about climate, that more than 1 million species are on track for extinction in the coming decades. That is the most rapid rate of extinction experienced yet on the planet. In the US alone, the western population of monarch butterfly has crashed by 99%. Those in the Midwest are still with us, but they too are at much reduced numbers. Bird populations in North America have declined by 30% in just the last 5 decades. In Hawaii, it's almost quiet. It's almost eerily quiet. More than 75% of its remaining bird species are classified as endangered or already extinct. More than 70 species of freshwater snails, 23 species of freshwater mussels have gone extinct, and nearly 70% of the remaining freshwater mussels are threatened with extinction. And that's just here in the US. We're just a small part of the globe. Around the world, as the world warms, as mentioned by Dr. Schnorr, the corals are dying. A third of the world's fish stocks are overfished. Over 40% of the world's amphibian species, a third of the marine mammals, and a third of sharks and fish are all threatened with extinction. The recent losses in forest and tree cover is going at tens of millions of acres per every few years, It is declining to some degree, but remains of significant concern because of the climate mediating function of our forest cover. Water is life, yet water in all of its forms are threatened. And I know some of you fought about the pipeline going in across Iowa, so you recognize the importance of water. Much of the global population is facing water insecurity in the very near future. Deserts are expanding and soil is being lost. And the 2030 Water Resources Group of the World Bank even predicts water demand will exceed supply by 40% by 2030. In all of this, in the background, the numbers of hungry people around the world are again growing. There was a while there where we thought we had caught up with advanced nourishment, but again, we are not getting the food to people who need it. Yet at the same time, all around the world, powerful industries continue to pollute land and water. Every year, 300 to 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic sludge are all dumped in the world's waters. Wildfires, as mentioned earlier, ravaged over 10 million acres in Australia, killed a billion, that's a number I can't even hardly begin to imagine, individual animals. Only months earlier, the worst fires in decades ravaged the Amazon rainforest. So these are things that are happening around the world. As was mentioned, coral reefs being the most diverse of all marine systems, harboring 25% of marine species, even though they only cover 2% of the entire ocean floor, are at great danger. Millions of people depend on the bounty from our coral reefs for both their nourishment and for their livelihoods. They're also under threat not only by the climate, by pollution, invasive species, and cyanide fishing. These are alarming numbers that cannot be ignored, and this is why we hope you can bring some of these subjects to the candidates. They will have to face some of them. Their losses and disappearances are surrogates for much of the desperation, the anger, the violent conflicts that we're feeling around the world. They represent underlying and preventable healthcare costs, life and death, at home here in the US and around the world. Our civilization depends on the services the natural world provides. Widespread pollinator declines, soil loss, water pollution, all imperil our global food supply. The world's rainforests and oceans provide the majority of the oxygen we all breathe, yet one man can simply decide to burn them down to serve whatever need he feels he needs. Our oceans are acidifying, as mentioned. These are all the quantifiable, tangible, consequential losses. And although we forget about it in our busy lives, people still retain deep connection to nature. They have physical connections to wildlife. They have contributed to our medicines, inspired our histories, our mythologies, our languages, and how we all view the world. Wildlife brings joy and enriches us all, and each extinction makes our home really a lonelier, a colder place. We must build awareness and attention that mobilizes our leaders. The next president needs to take immediate action in the fight to protect and save biodiversity. As a major global emitter of greenhouse gases and pollutants, the U.S. must show global leadership. The next president needs to declare the extinction crisis is both a national and an international emergency. Such a declaration brings with it certain obligated actions on the part of our government and those to which we are allied. We need to invest the funds, we're talking real money, to stem the disappearance of the world's wildlife and plants and protect irreplaceable places at home and around the world, to end illegal trafficking and overexploitation of wildlife and plants. They must prioritize the management of all public lands, the protection of biodiversity, maximizing natural carbon sequestration, and increasing climate resiliency. The Earth knows how to heal itself. We have to get out of the way and let it happen. Habitat loss and degradation remain the largest drivers of extinction in the U.S. and around the world. Turning this around is going to require implementing an ecosystem approach to recovery to protect habitat, forests, and foster ecological processes, addressing climate change, including building and protecting wildlife corridors. In other words, stopping some of the wall ideas that are happening on our southern border that inhibits not only people, but the natural life on the border from moving.
That's 10 minutes.
We must, am I done?
That's 10 minutes.
I'm 10 minutes. Oh my God, I'm sorry, this subject
sum
is
up.
a very intense subject. So there are lots of solutions. In the end, the Earth doesn't need us. We need the Earth, and we can't afford to continue to ignore the disappearance of all of the things that make this a beautiful blue planet. Thank you. I'm supposed to go on.
The first question is from Jesse Weiss. Jesse is a senior nursing student and Iowa City Foreign Relations Council intern.
So the New York Times says that 2/3 of their readers strongly value environmental issues and climate change. But with that, it has only become recent that the Democratic debates have focused on these issues. Knowing this, how would you advise the next president to take action with global leaders to make a change on environmental issues and climate change?
Thank you, Jesse. If only the president would listen to you and me, we'd be all set. You and me and Jerry. There are a number of treaties, there are a number of roles that our own Environmental Protection Agency was designed to implement. First of all, as Dr. Schnorr had mentioned, we need to stop the rollback of many of these rules and rather enforce and strengthen them. Within our global community, however, there are a number of invasive species treaties that we've also pulled out of. The U.S. once used to lead the world in the advancement of international wildlife conservation and ratified the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, Wild Fauna and Flora. But we need to step up and reinforce this one. We need to go back and ratify all the wildlife protection treaties, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, rejoin the World Heritage Convention, ratify the Convention on Migratory Species. There are actually treaties specific to particular species. We need to go back to ratifying and enforcing and promoting all of these wildlife protection treaties, and in particular, obviously, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and make it stronger. That would be my advice.
The next question is... The next question is from Jim Trepka. Jim is on the State Executive Council for the Sierra Club, and he heads the Iowa City chapter of the Sierra Club. Jim.
How would you advise the President in the role the U.S. could take in leading the world in preserving habitats and preventing environmental degradation?
I would have to spend at least a day or two with him, Jim, to answer that question. Her, okay, yeah. I'm sorry, up until now it's all been hims. Obviously, we have a long way to go, and as I mentioned, strengthening and reactivating our EPA is a great place to start, but also rejoining a number of the treaties that the UN has sponsored would be another place to go. And lastly, as an Iowan, I can't help but wanting to say we have got to get out of the business of producing food a major profit-centered business rather than something that supports our lives and livelihoods. So industrial agriculture in Iowa, the way it's being done, is not sustainable. industrial agriculture and confined animal facilities are destroying our air, losing our soil, destroying our water, and this has got to be stopped. And wherever we find industrial agricultural processes that are willy-nilly destroying in the name of producing food, I think all of that has to be readdressed and reassessed. And all states, all nations can work together to make a just transition from fossil fuels. But it will take not only the leadership in our country, but it will take joining leaders in all the other countries to make all of this possible. We have to work together as well and recognize the power, the insights, the strengths of our indigenous communities to protect our land and our water. For too long, we have ignored the wisdom among us, and I think it is time that we re-engage with our indigenous communities and give them the respect and the dignity and the regard that they so deserve. That would be some of my advice.
Thank you, Maureen. Okay, we're actually doing really well on time. So, with everyone's permission, what I'd like to suggest is that I'll do a few minutes on nuclear weapons. We'll have a question from Ben. And then if you have questions for any of the speakers, questioners, or anyone else that's gone, write them on your card, and we'll do some questions after this nuclear section. Yes?
Sounds good.
Okay. Jerry says yes. Do you all say yes? We're in.
Just one second, Mr. Moderator. I noticed a few people were getting up because I think they came to hear from the candidates. I want you to know we do have somebody special coming. So I hope that you will wait to hear our special guest.
Okay.
They're running around the state, you know, they can't be everywhere at once.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Nuclear weapons. Bad news and good news. There is no problem more grave than nuclear weapons. No other problem, racism, climate change, opioid addiction, economic inequality, gun violence, erosion of values, nothing that now confronts the United States is larger and of greater urgency than the danger of nuclear war. In the long run, climate change might create wider destruction and harm, but first we would have to get to the long run. And the chances of a nuclear war are as great today as they have ever been. In this hour, in this season, we, as a nation, are more angry, more thoughtless, more rash, more inclined to extremism, and more heedless of consequences than at any other time in our history. Nuclear weapons are unique among the dangers we face because all the pieces necessary for catastrophic destruction are already in place, able to begin at a minute's notice and at a single person's whim. I've been thinking about nuclear weapons for more than 35 years. I still remember a talk I gave at a college some years ago when a young woman came up to me afterwards and she was clearly upset. She asked me if what I had said about the danger were really true. And I tried to, as gently as possible, tell her that yes, it's a very dangerous situation. And she asked angrily, almost tearfully, then why don't they do something? And over the years, her question has haunted me. Why don't they do something? Has there ever been a problem as serious as this one that has been left largely unattended for so many years? Has there ever been a country in history that confronted a significant danger and did nothing? I cannot think of one. Experts and government officials reassure us that nuclear weapons are perfectly safe, the system in place to avoid nuclear war, the mutual threats of nuclear deterrence will always work. But all of us know, even children, that those reassurances are hollow. It is obvious, it is as obvious as human nature and as certain as the logic of 3 short sentences. First, human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes. No one's perfect, from the lowest soldier to the highest leader. Second, nuclear deterrence is a human process. We're involved at every step. We make the threats. We evaluate the threats. We decide how to respond. Nuclear deterrence isn't a machine that runs on its own in the corner. So, if human beings are inclined to folly, and we are, and if nuclear deterrence involves human beings, and it does, then nuclear deterrence is inherently flawed by definition. It is fallible. It will fail. It's not a question of if. It's just a matter of when. And people know this. Ordinary people feel this truth in their bones. Surveys show that a large percentage of people, and especially young people, expect a nuclear war to happen in their lifetimes. How can we have hope, much less the determination to solve challenging problems, if we feel trapped on death row? And recent developments are sobering. I'll just run through a few. In the past 3 years, the current president has canceled nuclear weapons treaties, including the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the JCPOA, the treaty preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. At the same time, this administration has called for an additional $494 billion in spending on nuclear weapons, on top of the $1.2 trillion that was already committed. Despite threats and face-to-face meetings and letters, no progress has been made on a deal to halt the North Korean nuclear weapons program, and they appear to be moving ahead rapidly. And this month, the current president used drones to kill one of Iran's leaders, instigating a crisis that could easily have led to war. It was a clear demonstration, if one were needed, how close we stand to the edge. But there is hope. A realistic reevaluation of nuclear weapons shows that they are not dangerous and useful. They are just dangerous. They are clumsy, blundering military tools, hardly useful at all. Their usefulness is all exaggeration and wishful thinking. The experts and officials who tell us confidently that nuclear weapons are essential are like the islanders that live beneath a smoking, deadly volcano, who look up at that volcano with awe and say in hushed voices, "It's protecting us." The assumptions that guide experts and officials are mostly wrong, but that's not surprising. Those assumptions were formed during the Cold War. The Cold War was a time of enormous fear, and no one does their best thinking when they're afraid. For example, it turns out that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not cause Japan to surrender, so the reputation that the weapons got as miraculous war-winning weapons is undeserved. And much of the rest of the reputation that nuclear weapons have is false as well. It now seems obvious that nuclear weapons are not very useful militarily. The claim that they can't be disinvented is nonsense. The notion that they will be with us forever is clearly wrong. And the belief that everyone would build nuclear weapons if they could is projection, emotional projection, not reality. The reality is this. In 2017, 122 countries voted for a treaty in the United Nations banning nuclear weapons. And so far, 35 countries have signed and ratified that treaty. 15 more, and the treaty enters into force. Although it will take more than that to finally eliminate nuclear weapons, clearly not everyone wants to build nuclear weapons. There is real determination in much of the world to do something about this danger, and we should join that effort and do our part to make it happen. If the assumptions that underlie nuclear weapons are false, then if we can get experts and government officials to face reality and change their assumptions, it is an easier step to eliminate nuclear weapons if you understand that they're not very useful weapons and very dangerous technology. Consider, if you had a stove that couldn't boil water, and then one day you found out that it has a tendency to blow up, that technology in your house would be both not very useful and dangerous. Would you keep that stove? Of course you wouldn't. If nuclear weapons are dangerous and prone to blow up at any moment unexpectedly, and it turns out that they're not that useful, that they seem militarily powerful, but you can't actually use them because they're too big, eliminating them is within our grasp. Nuclear weapons are a grave and urgent problem, but they are a problem, perhaps surprisingly, that we can solve. Thank you. The first question is from Ben Otoadesi. Ben is a high school student from Iowa City High.
Today, the United States retains the option to be the first to use nuclear weapons in conflict, even in response to a non-nuclear attack. The No First Use Act would put into place what so many Americans already believe, that the U.S. should never initiate a nuclear war. Do you support no first use? If not, why? And how would you advise the president to assure that the U.S. will never engage in a nuclear war?
It's a great question. Why does the United States need to be the first to use nuclear weapons? Would anybody want the United States to use nuclear weapons? Show of hands. Okay. Well, Truman said they were weapons of last resort. Why was Truman wrong? I would advise the president, I think absolutely, no first use would devalue nuclear weapons worldwide. It wouldn't put us at any greater risk, because everyone would believe that we might go back on our word if we were attacked, and so, or that it wouldn't put us at greater risk. And there's no harm in it. You don't get rid of any weapons or change any policies. You're simply saying we won't use them first, and it's a smart thing to do. I don't think it goes far enough. It's basically just a change in spoken policy, but it's a great first step. And the Obama administration actually talked about it at the end of their run, but they didn't decide to do it. So now, for a few minutes, let's have questions. Anybody have a question? I'm going to come down and anybody? Let's see. Here's a question. Stand up and read your question, sir.
Well, this might be a question for Jerry or Maureen or for Jeffrey. The U.S. military consumes more fossil fuel and emits more CO2 than any other organization in the world. It also has a budget about 120 times that of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. What advice would you give the next U.S. president in light of these facts and others?
Very good. That's a great question. I didn't actually even know that the military was that predominant of emitter. But maybe one thing that I forgot to say earlier is relevant here, and that is Citizens Climate Lobby, as you know, has pushed for a long time and relatively effectively for a fee and dividend. And that's what's missing as we talked about mitigating our emissions and stabilizing the atmosphere and climate change, good things are happening. We are improving solar and wind power, and the costs are coming down. They're still small relative to coal, oil, and natural gas as a primary energy option, but we need to send a signal into the marketplace, and that signal could be a fee and dividend in which a tax goes on to the cost of oil and carbon-based fuels at the point of entry or at the point of commercial production. And that gets passed through the system. The fee that is collected at the point of entry is returned to every citizen on an equal basis with a monthly check, much like Social Security. Maybe they would be the ones to administer. And meanwhile, the carbon fee would increase, thus making coal, oil, and natural gas much, much more expensive, thus making the military unable to afford it and hopefully reducing their carbon emissions just like everybody else. In the meantime, economies of scale for energy efficiency, solar, wind, and everything will cause those to become even much, much, much cheaper. And the net effect on most people, the average, will be to actually save money. Those who are profligate users, like the military, will be the ones hardest hit, and they will, hopefully, that effectively reduces their budget, which, as your question implies, maybe isn't such a bad idea after all. So that's where I would start, with a fee and dividend.
Thanks, Dr. Schnorr. I appreciate that question, and my answer would be a little bit different. We seem to have endless funds for the military, and so I'm not 100% certain that a fee and dividend is going to work with the military, because they have an endless budget. They can put whatever amount of money they want into whatever it is they want. So I might ask the president, he or she, to consider, do we need 800 bases? Do we need to be shipping military equipment and service people to 800 bases around the world? If we cut out some of those expenditures, we would also cut out some of our emissions. And then I'd begin to ask, what do we need to equip them with? If military isn't going to solve climate, it's not going to solve environmental degradation, it's not going to solve our concerns about accidental or intentional use of nuclear weapons, what are we arming this military to do? Why don't we begin to think about them doing something for our environment, for our climate? It's a lot of resources, it's a lot of intelligence. Let's get them to be part of the workforce, and thereby cutting their emissions simply because of the kind of work they are then involved in. As it is right now, we're spending something close to $1 million on many of these individual service providers, which tells me we have endless funds when it comes for the military, and that funding is not going to be the way that we will control their emissions. We will have to change their role or change our perception of the role of military in securing a livable, sustainable, healthy, and secure future.
Maybe we need a new division. Like the Space Force, maybe we need a new division of military called the Eco Force.
And I skipped over Newman Abuisa, which is entirely my fault. Newman, you have a question. Newman is a civil engineer who grew up in Syria and is going to ask me a very difficult question about nuclear weapons in the Middle East, or anything else you'd like to ask.
Thank you. Lots of discussion has been about fossil fuel. The fossil fuel, most of it is situated in the Middle East. And military, I guess, is one of the issues. The heart of the problems in the world are in the Middle East. And the problem basically is that the Brookings Institute said that we cannot denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And now Korea has about 15 warheads. The Middle East also have some nuclear weapons, and our previous president worked hard to reach an agreement with Iran to control the development of enriched uranium, basically, which lead to nuclear weapons in Iran, and our current president withdrew from that treaty. We know that Israel has about 200 warheads of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Can we denuclearize the Middle East? And do we have double standards there?
Second question first. Yes, we have double standards there. And yes, I think we can denuclearize the Middle East, and I think we can denuclearize North Korea. I think we can denuclearize the world. The problem is that we focus on the animosity between the sides, and we say, they'll never stop hating each other. But the trick is not to make them stop hating each other. The trick is to make them see that nuclear weapons aren't useful tools for hating each other. If I have a handgun and I use it to wave at my enemies because I hate them, then that's something I want to keep. But if someone whispers in my ear, your handgun blows up every third time it's used, then I put that aside. So I don't think there are lots of established figures who say we can only get rid of nuclear weapons when we change the political system, when the hot spots around the world go away. I don't think that's true. I think if you show that nuclear weapons are bad technology, it changes the game. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Aha, yes.
Thank you. I appreciated the comment that education for women could really make a difference in terms of climate crisis. I want to just add, Anita Hill was in Iowa City recently and pointed out that we are living with a virtual silence about violence against women and children, or she called it gender-based violence. And I think it's impossible to separate that. I mean, I recognize there's intersectionality and we can't work on everything, but that silence is very disturbing. And I would like to remember and remind people that in the 1980s, some of you remember, there was an enormous anti-nuke movement. And it was a time when the women's movement and the peace movement joined forces. I remember being at a protest with 1 million people in New York City against nuclear weapons. I remember women getting arrested at nuclear bases, nuclear arms bases, and going to prison. I remember thousands of women surrounding the Pentagon and bringing up the issue of nuclear weapons and its connection with violence against women. And so I would ask if you would be willing, anybody willing to make this point to these politicians. I mean, the presidential debates are silent on this issue. And I do think it's connected in all sorts of important ways. So I think it needs discussion.
Hi, my name is Jeff Cox. I was going to ask Maureen this question, but I'm not going to put her on the spot. I'm going to ask everyone else here this question after seeing her speak today. Would you be willing to encourage her to run for Congress? We've got an open seat. This is where you pick up seats. It would certainly be worthwhile to have her giving advice to a president from the U.S. House of Representatives, not to mention having a vote on things like AUMF, military funding, and so forth. So I think, if we want to change American foreign policy with an open seat in Congress, now's the time to do it. So let's talk about it.
Thank you.
I
right.
think he was referring to Quinn, right?
We're going to have to put your announcement off for a moment so we can continue with the program.
Don't touch it. Here.
My mic is on.
Maybe going off, maybe. This one's
Good. And I'd like now to introduce Megan Phillips, who is going to introduce our surrogate from an actual candidate's campaign. Megan is the interim co-director of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. Megan.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm excited and honored to introduce today a friend of mine, Abshir Omar, who is representing the Bernie Sanders political campaign for presidency 2020. He's here today to talk to you a bit about how Senator Sanders feels about his hopes and plans for what his administration would do in terms of their global issues. And then he also has a personal tie to the United States being a leader in global issues, as he is a refugee from Somalia. He came over with his mother in their youth. So I am excited, and please help me welcome Abshir Omar.
All right, thank you so much, Megan. I appreciate the invitation and to spend this time with you all. My name is Abshir Omar, and I was born in Somalia. And my family fled the country during the Civil War. And when I was born in my mother's living room. Civil War had destroyed all infrastructure in the country, hospitals, schools, social services were no longer existent, and my mother had to give birth to me in her own home. No anesthesiologist, no doctor, no midwife. And prior to that, 2 months before that, my father was killed in the fighting, as millions of others have died in that conflict. And my family had to flee the country, and we got on a bus out of the city. My mother, myself at 2 months old, and my siblings. And this bus left the capital and drove south towards the Kenyan border. And we stopped at a rest area for the bus to refuel. And my mother got off the bus, took her sandals off, and was holding me in her arms and was walking around. And out of nowhere, rebels came and started firing at the bus and the people in the area. And my mother had to jump in a ditch to hide. And the bus driver got spooked and drove off, and my siblings were still on that bus. And my mother laid in this ditch for a couple hours, hearing gunfires, mortar rounds, and chaos all around her. And when the fighting stopped, she came out of this ditch and found dozens of bodies strewn around the ground. And she started to walk, no shoes. She started to walk, and she's on the equator on a road, and her feet start to blister and to bleed, and she's walking. And you would think that that was the worst of everything that's, to pass. But she walked into another rebel encampment as she was going down the road. And a soldier carrying an AK-47 walked up to my mother with me in her arms. And this soldier's job, his only job, is to commit genocide, to kill people like my mother and myself. But this soldier, luckily, didn't do that. He still had a little bit of humanity in him. And he saw a grieving mother, desperate, at her wit's end with a young infant, and he said, I can't do it. My humanity can't bring me to do this. And instead of killing us, he took his army boots off, and he gave it to my mother. And he walked with her for hours, getting her out of the rebel encampment. And every time a group of soldiers would come up and say, who is this woman? He would vouch for her. He says, no. She's my neighbor. She's from my tribe, right? And that's the only reason I'm alive today, that I'm standing here in front of you all, because one soldier had the decency and humanity not to follow orders. And this is a story that's been repeated throughout human history, where nations, out of spite, out of hatred, one community going after another. And my family eventually, we made it to the UN refugee camp in Kenya in the Dadaab Desert. And we lived there for 4.5 years. So the first 4 years of my life was in a desert, in a camp run by the UN, living in a tent. No health care, no education. The only food you have to eat is that which came through charity from folks in this audience probably who donated to the UNHCR or the Red Cross. And that's the story of my beginning, but it's also the story of millions of people across the world today. I was lucky enough to get a visa. Our family moved to the United States. I grew up in Seattle in a pretty good neighborhood, and I had access to a really good education, right? I had world-class education, learned English. I was in ESL till the 7th grade, and I was able to apply myself, and I had opportunities to become who I am today. Not because of some intrinsic quality in who I am or who my family is, but because I had the basic opportunities of life to get an education, have health care, live in a safe community, and have the opportunity to learn and to grow. But for millions of people around the world, whether it's in Bangladesh, Iraq, Somalia, Kosovo, those conditions aren't there today. People are living in fear, they're living under siege, and the United States, in a lot of these places, have a lot to do with what's going on. Whether it's our involvement in Latin America, in the last 3 decades, and how we've propped up regimes there, how we are assisting the Saudis in bombing Yemen today, killing thousands of people and starving millions more. And for me, coming to Iowa, attended Iowa State University, and I decided, I was going to do something about our political climate. And I looked around, and in 2016, I supported Senator Sanders. I caucused for him. But this time around, I wasn't sure. And, I sat down with his team and we talked about his philosophy, his chances, what the campaign is about. And I decided to support Senator Sanders because he and I share one common thing. A worldview not based in violence, not based in resource extraction, not based in neocolonialism, but based in basic human dignity. That people should have the right to determine their future. That we should be a democratic nation, not attacking other countries for their resources. We should not be in an endless war. We should not be overthrowing regimes. But the United States needs to be a leader for human rights and democracy. And this campaign has been all about that. And when you look at the senator's beliefs and his policies, they reflect that basic notion that human dignity over all else, justice over all else. And it's been the hallmark of his career in the House and in the Senate, and even as mayor, standing up for what's right. As you know, with the Saudi bombing of Yemen, Senator Sanders, in conjunction with Congressman Ro Khanna, introduced the War Powers Act, the first time it's ever been invoked to stop a war. That takes courage, that takes gut, that takes responsibility to stand up and say we're not going to support a regime who is attacking innocent civilians abroad with our dollars, right? It stands up to when Senator Sanders is talking about the Iran nuclear deal, that we need to be a responsible country and we need to get back to the negotiating table and prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's about the Green New Deal, Senator Sanders standing up saying that instead of spending $1.7 trillion buying weapons of destruction, the nations of the world need to come together to stop climate change, our true one enemy in this world. And it's a hallmark of who he is. No matter the fight, no matter the issue, you can always expect Senator Sanders to stand up on the right side of history. As the last 4 decades are no different. If you go online, if you see any war that the United States has gone into in the last 4 decades, you'll see a video of Senator Sanders railing against it on the House floor or the Senate floor. If you look at climate change, he was talking about the dangers of climate change far before it became popular, far before politicians got on board, far before many scientists even agreed on the issue. Senator Sanders was standing and railing against climate change. When it comes to issues of standing up for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, he was there before it was popular. His entire record, his entire public record, is that of justice, equity, freedom, and fighting for things that are difficult. He's never taken a stance that was poll-tested. He never stood up for issues because it was going to get him a campaign contribution or get him a vote. He's always made the hard decision based on what's right and not what's politically expedient. And for me, as a refugee, as a Muslim, I have family all over the world. And I have to make a decision. And for many people in my community, the decision is very simple. Who do we trust not to bomb our family? It sounds crude, but it's how we think, right? I have family in Somalia. And many of you may not know this, but there are drone strikes every single week in Somalia. And in 2011, under a Democratic administration, there was a drone strike in Mogadishu that killed my brother with my tax dollars. This is the reality for thousands and millions of people across the country and across the world, that our foreign policy decisions impact human lives. We talk about collateral damage. We talk about unintended consequences. But in reality, these are human beings. These are human lives, lives that deserve dignity, respect, and we as a nation have to be responsible for our actions. We need to work together to solve our problems diplomatically, not invade countries for resource extraction for dubious reasons. And when I look across the Democratic, candidates' profiles, there's only one that stands out very clearly on this issue, on foreign policy, and it's Senator Sanders. We have candidates who are okay with continuing wars for the next 30, 40 years. We have candidates that are okay with this budget, military budget, that makes no sense. We're spending trillions of dollars buying bombs and planes to attack enemies we don't have. We spend more money than the next 18 countries combined. It makes absolutely no sense. And Senator Sanders has been very clear about this, that he will not continue this ridiculous and irresponsible military budget. And not to mention that the United States military is one of the largest polluters on planet Earth. So for me, it was quite simple. When it comes to climate change, Senator Sanders has been the leader and continues to be the leader, pushing the Green New Deal, the most comprehensive, bold plan to solve the climate crisis. When it comes to foreign policy, no one compares to Senator Sanders' record of standing up for human rights, no matter the hue or nationality of the person on the other end. And it's testament to his character and his record. And I'm not going to take too much time. I want to open up to the floor for a Socratic conversation on the issues. I want to hear your thoughts, and I'll take some questions and pass it back to you.
Okay. We have two things we're going to do before we take audience questions. First, a question from Andrew Bond. Andrew is a student in the international relations and in journalism and a member of the Iowa City or an intern? Member? Yeah. Member, yeah. A full member. The Iowa City Foreign Relations Council.
Hello, Abshir. So industrial and mass production farming is one of the largest contributors to climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said last August that the entire food production system, including transportation, accounted for 37% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. They called for an improved land use and less meat-intensive diets as part of the comprehensive, urgent effort needed to prevent a global climate catastrophe. How can our leaders work with others to find more environmentally sustainable and healthier ways to produce food to feed the world? And what alternatives can we turn to in regards to our imports and exports of mass-produced meat?
First of all, we as a country have a dietary issue. As you can see, I'm not immune to it. We are not the healthiest country on earth, and our food production and the availability of food stocks is one of those issues. And here in Iowa, particularly an agricultural state, we have an issue with water quality. I heard not too long ago that Iowa is #1 for #2. Fecal matter from hogs in the state. And we have over 700 impaired bodies of water in the state. Rivers that people cannot fish, cannot swim in. I'm from Des Moines, and recently, as you all know, Des Moines Waterworks tried to sue the polluters upstream for the nitrate issues and also the fecal matter that's being dumped in our rivers that citizens of Des Moines have to pay to clean out. And personally, I don't trust the water in Des Moines. I drink bottled water. But it's not an issue just for Des Moines. It's an issue all around this country. Food production, especially factory farms, are an issue. They're destroying our landscape, they're destroying our water quality, but most importantly, they're also destroying livelihoods of small farmers, right? Small family farms. And, you know, we support a moratorium on factory farms. We support a moratorium on these facilities that are destroying our environment. And more importantly, we have to find solutions that are going to help our economy, the environment, and also the health of the American people. And we're going to do just that.
Thank you very much.
So now you get a choice. Which of the following questions would you like? A question on the environment, a question on the United Nations, a question on multilateralism, a question on militarism, or nuclear weapons?
All good choices.
Yes, you're on the spot.
The United Nations for 500.
Okay, United Nations, a question from Carolina Herrera.
Hi. So Senator Sanders said that if elected, he would restore the trust in the United Nations. The question is, how would he do that?
It's very simple. The United States needs to stop being a bully. We are one country on this earth. We have the largest military. We have the strongest economy to a certain degree on this earth. But what we've seen with the Trump administration is the United States pulling out of almost every single international agreement that's been fought for decades. We see a nation, or should I say a president, who is reckless in his remarks when it comes to other countries, joking about buying other countries, as we saw with Greenland. You know, it's laughable, but it's also a sign for other countries of the seriousness of our administration, of our country, and of our presidency. And Senator Sanders has been known to work across the aisle. He's a person who believes in diplomacy, and he's a person who speaks truth. So for us as a country, first we need to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. We need to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. We need to start acting as a good neighbor on this earth. We should not be threatening other countries with war, as we've seen recently with the Iran escalation. And basically, we need to have an administration that is willing to go above petty politics, sit down with our friends around the world and people who are not our friends, and talk about our common interests. Talk about saving this planet from climate change, talking about ending wars, ending famine. In the year 2020, for us to have millions of people across the world in famines, you know, dying of hunger, is a moral conundrum for us as a nation and as a planet. And for the Sanders administration, we're going to rebuild trust with the United Nations by working with our partners, by being decent people, by working with our folks around the world on issues, on the economy, on terrorism, and on a whole host of issues.
Okay, great. One last question from us, and then it's up to you. So if you have questions for Senator Sanders' representative, write them down. You're next. David Hempel is Vice President of the local chapter of Veterans for Peace, and he has a question for you on militarism.
Historically, our policymakers have argued that fighting terrorism in other parts of the world is imperative in protecting our national security. Do you believe the best way to do this is through the traditional post-9/11 model of a strong military presence abroad? And what changes, if any, would you make to this model to most effectively fight international terrorism?
That's a very good question. And it's also a very personal one for me, because when 9/11 happened and we had this new infrastructure in our country, Homeland Security, and the whole host of legislation that came through, they were coming down on Muslims, people like me. I remember folks were afraid to leave their homes, they were afraid to go to school, and we had, you know, a lot of violence happen to people in this country. But also abroad, we have to remember that people in Yemen, in Syria, whether they're from Cambodia or Somalia, they are just no different than you and I. They're people with hopes and dreams. They want to raise their kids, make sure that they have access to education, healthcare. They want a job. They want to be able to provide for their family. And we have to treat people with the dignity that they deserve because of their humanity. And for us, fighting terrorism abroad, what we've seen happen in Iraq has not made us safer. It has made this world much more dangerous. We've radicalized a lot of people through violence. And as a country, we can do better. We can work with our allies abroad, making sure that we're snuffing out terrorism where it is and not attacking the people of an entire nation, not demonizing people. And for us, we have to be careful, right? Fighting terrorism, fighting an ideology is a difficult thing. We're not fighting a standing army. We're not fighting a country. We're fighting radicals who have taken a message and, of a religion and skewed it for their own political purposes. And first of all, we have to call it what it is. It's not radical Islamic terrorism. They're thugs and terrorists, right? We're not going after an entire nation of people because of who they are, what they look like, or what they believe in. But for us to be safer, we need to be able to talk with folks and help them rebuild their economies. We need to have discussions about the truth of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We need to be talking about how we're complicit in the war in Yemen. We need to be honest with that, and we need to have a real vigorous discussion on how to rebuild our brand abroad. How do we rehabilitate America's image? Because it's going to be a big issue going forward. We have a president today that has tarnished the American name, and every time I travel abroad and people ask me, oh, you're American, first thing they ask is, tell me about Cardi B, and second thing is, how did you vote for Donald Trump? And it's a reality we have to look at. America has lost respect on the international stage because of our actions. We have killed millions of people in war. We have supported other dictators who have made life horrible for millions more. And for people around the world, would you trust the United States today with Donald Trump at the head? I don't think anyone in their right mind would. I don't trust him. And for us, fighting terrorism is going to be about winning the hearts and minds of the people, right? But also working with our neighbors to make sure that we're protecting our national security interests at the same time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Questions? Nobody has a question for Senator Sanders' representative? Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Would you have any sense, or have you maybe heard him talk about just outright unilateral nuclear disarmament?
That's a very difficult question to answer. First of all, Senator Sanders believes in disarmament. Nuclear weapons do not make us safer. It only makes the world a little more dangerous. And it's a very nuanced conversation to have because of the proliferation that we have, so many countries in the world having hundreds of warheads. So we believe in de-escalation. We believe, first of all, immediately we need to start negotiations with Iran to get them back to the table and make sure we're back at the table as well. But also to talk with countries around the world to talk about de-escalating and getting rid of some of our nuclear warheads. But it's going to be difficult to do it in one swoop, but you have to have that conversation. But more importantly, a leader that believes that nuclear weapons are not a deterrent. They are not a deterrent. They are dangerous in themselves. So Senator Sanders is very serious about talking about reducing stockpiles and working with our partners around the world. And it's not going to be happening overnight, not in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but it has to be a conversation that needs to start. And that happens at the negotiating table, which we are not currently doing.
Okay. I know you have questions. Presidential candidate, representative, just a sec, I'm going to get this young woman in the, oh, here we go.
I'd just like to hear more about Bernie Sanders' proposed budget. How much of the military would he be willing to cut? Right now, I think we're spending something upwards of $27,000 a second, and now with the new appropriation, it's going to be even higher. How much of the military budget will he cut so that we can afford clean water and clean, environment, education, healthcare infrastructure? What's he willing to do?
Great question.
for anyone who's been watching these debates or has been reading into what the senator is saying is he is the only candidate on that debate stage who talks about the dangers of militarism, but more importantly, the dangers of the military-industrial complex and how it is subverting our democracy, how it is entangling us in foreign interventions we should not be involved in, and how it is destroying our environment. You know, no one talks about how the U.S. military is one of the largest polluters on planet Earth. And as a society, we need to talk about reducing the military budget. That's going to be a conversation for us to have with Congress. And I think what we'll see is very drastic cuts in military spending and diverting that money towards diplomacy to the State Department, making sure that we're building alliances and friendships across the world and that we're providing resources to our partners to help solve and alleviate a lot of the issues that we're dealing with.
Okay, more questions. So down back here, I promised you that you'd ask a question. There you go.
So just stepping back a little bit back to the nuclear issue. So there, just to scope down on some specifics as to what Sanders would say on nuclear policy in the U.S., there's some legislative interest and movement on no first use and no sole authority. And obviously, with our current president, there are some easy answers there. But how would you feel about no first use and no sole authority if Sanders was president? Or how would Sanders feel about that?
So interestingly, on that issue, before President Obama signed that deal, I was a student at Bellevue College, and I was part of the Model United Nations program. And we were in New York at the UN building, and I was in a plenary session where we broke out and we passed that resolution before the United States government even took notice of it. So I was part of the early stages of that discussion. And it goes back to what Senator Sanders says. War should be the last option. We're adults. We can talk about our problems. We can sit down and negotiate, an amicable decision-making on those issues. And personally, Senator Sanders has not spoken on that issue, but knowing him and knowing his history, I don't think he would be the one to be worried about that issue. He believes in diplomacy. He believes in coming to the table. He believes in bringing regional governments together to solve these issues, because we are not the world's policemen. But we can be part of the solution and joining those conversations to help bring these dialogues together. But I would not be worried about that.
Okay, more questions. Here we go.
Hi. This is not so much a question as a comment, and I really like Senator Sanders, and I love everything that you said on the foreign policy here. But it kind of puzzles me, when you say that he's the only candidate who speaks against the war, or even, he's the only candidate on the debate stage. And unfortunately, Tulsi Gabbard couldn't be here today, but it's strange to me that we're excluding, one of the strongest voices right now, one of the candidates who is still running and who is actually embraced across the aisles, whose sole issue is ending the endless wars. And I would like to see, everyone working together, and in your messaging when you talk about this, everyone has their own candidate, but it seems wrong to me to pretend that this veteran woman who has been serving this country and who is really put her life towards this issue is not even mentioned when you talk about the presidential candidates. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's a good point to bring up. And I was referring to the Iraq War, and Senator Sanders was one of the few voices on the floor of the House and Senate to rail against that war and talk about what it was in its entirety. Tulsi is a wonderful person. She is someone I admire, but it was in reference to that.
Okay. You have questions. Yes?
Hi, thank you for being here. I just had a question. I looked up quick on Wikipedia, and I saw that the 2001 AUMF was passed the Senate 98-0. which tells me that Senator Sanders must have voted in favor of that. But I wonder what President Sanders would have, what would Senator Sanders' vision of what we should have done in those days have been back in 2001, 2002? I wonder if he's spoken on that.
Absolutely, and you're quite right. Senator Sanders has been talking about the problems of war, and in particular, how we are not following our constitutional requirements. The Congress has power to declare war. The President does not. And he speaks frankly about that. Congress needs to assert its constitutional authority on that issue, and that we should not be allowing presidents under these dubious acts to engage in endless wars. And he also brings up the issue of Afghanistan. The only person in the United States Congress to stand up against that war was Barbara Lee. And he was quite honest and frank about it on the debate stage. And that's also one thing that's quite refreshing about Senator Sanders is he's not afraid to tell the truth, right? He brought up that issue himself. It was unsolicited. But it comes back to the issue of integrity. We need to have someone in the White House who is willing to tell the truth, who's willing to own up to issues, who's willing to stand up for truth and justice. And I think Senator Sanders exemplifies that quite well on that issue. And also it brings up the issue of the only presidential campaign that's willing to stand before you and answer the tough questions on foreign policy and war and all these issues is the Sanders campaign. Today, that is in this room representing a candidate, should I say. But this is what our campaign is about. We're about facing these issues directly and being honest and having these conversations, right? Our politicians should not be hiding on these issues. We should be talking about them frankly because they are some of the most important conversations we need to have. They have far-reaching impact on our society and our country and our partners around the world.
Okay, last question.
Behind you.
Okay. Go get him. Don't get arrested.
Thank you very much for your last comment there. Mike, I totally agree. We're talking about the most important questions that we could possibly be talking about. And you are the only candidate surrogate here, and this room is, what, 10% full, if that? What is Senator Sanders and what are we going to do about engaging the American people so that we can get about the business of solving these?
Absolutely. Talking about engaging, Senator Sanders has been fighting an uphill battle his entire life. He has been fighting against municipal issues in Burlington with developers, fighting for housing for people in his community, making sure that we're taking care of public spaces. He's been fighting against the oil lobby. He's been fighting against pharmaceuticals. He's been fighting for healthcare for all. He's been fighting against wars. He's been fighting against every single issue you can imagine. And on all these issues, for every blunder that we make in this country, there's a video of Senator Sanders warning, wagging a finger, saying, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. And for our campaign, we've been going around this country, and in particular here in Iowa, we've been going around the state. And I've had the personal privilege of going corner to corner from Orange City to Keokuk, from Dubuque to Mount Ayr, talking in small cities of 200 to the Des Moines and Cedar Rapids of the state. And Senator Sanders has held more rallies and town halls than any other presidential candidate running today. And, I'm quite tired, to be honest, at this point, holding these many rallies. But what the senator is doing is he's been taking his message to the people directly, right? The pundits are against him, social media and the media in general are not portraying the issues correctly. But what he's done is he's been able to talk to the American people and to talk to Iowans about these issues. He is one of the only candidates that speaks forcefully about the issues of Palestine, talking about in the debate that Palestinians deserve human rights, and as president, he's going to hold the Israeli authorities accountable to that issue, to protect the Palestinian people. That takes guts and grits to do in this campaign, but that's a testament to his integrity on these issues, that he cares about justice above all else. And as you've seen today in a poll, we're winning. Senator Sanders' message has been getting across to the American public. When we're talking about young kids in this country, he has more support of young kids. When we're talking about African Americans 35 and under, Senator Sanders eclipses every single other demographic. When we talk about Muslims in this country, they have coalesced around Senator Sanders because we've been sharing that message directly with the voters. And we've been talking about these issues in a relational way. We're not about transactional politics coming to you every 2 and 4 years for your vote. We want to talk about solving these solutions. And our campaign talks about that winning the presidency is not enough. To get any of this done, the American people need to stand up and fight back, and they need to change Congress. Because Senator Sanders believes that a grassroots movement is the only way we're going to solve these issues. It's not going to be a top-down solution, it's going to be a bottom-up solution. So yes, we've been talking and talking and talking, and we're going to continue to talk to folks around this country. And that has shown off. Right now we are poised in Iowa in first place in New Hampshire, first place in Nevada, first in California. We're second place in South Carolina, soon to be first, because we've been going out and talking to the voters, talking about the issues that matter to them. And I'm really excited about 9 days from now what's going to happen in Iowa. Iowans are going to send a message to the rest of the world as to where this country is going to go. And right now we are posed to have a Sanders victory in Iowa, but that's a victory for human rights, that's a victory for foreign policy, that's a victory for climate change, that's a victory for the American working class. And we're very proud of the work that we're doing, but we understand that there's so much more to be done. We need to engage all people. We need to expand the electorate. We can't be doing the same thing. We need to engage those people who feel disillusioned by our politics. And our campaign has done that pretty well, but we're going to continue to do that. We're not taking anything for granted. Thank you.
Just a little something to read. That's terrific. And we're very grateful to Senator Sanders for sending a representative and participating in this forum. And now we're going to go on to militarism, costs and consequences. And up first is Jeff Weiss. Jeff, I don't have a bio of you, so you'll have to introduce yourself. I apologize.
It's all right.
My fault.
Okay. Hello. Yeah, my name is Jeffrey Weiss. I teach at Des Moines Area Community College, and I used to be the Peace Education Director for the American Friends Service Committee. We've spoken a lot tonight already about militarism and war, so I'm going to be pretty brief because I think about half of what I had to say, especially some of the statistics have already been reeled off. First thing I want to mention is that the United States has a permanent war economy. We have an empire of military bases, and we are in a state of perpetual war. And probably the only people in the world who don't recognize the status of the United States and its military power around the world are the people of the United States. There's a 2013 Gallup poll of more than 60,000 people, which was a cross-section of the entire world, and it asked a very, very simple question. Which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And you guys know what country won running away. That's the kind of poll that is reported in European newspapers in Asia, but is never going to see the light of day in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or in any of our corporate media in the United States, or for that matter, National Public Radio. The late Chalmers Johnson identified a term, an empire military bases. He was actually a conservative Far East analyst who wrote some pretty powerful books before he died, passed away a few years ago. We forget that military bases overseas was really the spark that lit Osama bin Laden. 8 years to the day that U.S. set military forces into Saudi Arabia, 2 U.S. embassies were blown up, one in Kenya and one in Tanzania. It was really this organization that was formed out of the 80s, Al-Qaeda, that really got its lift, so to speak. And of course, we know on September 11, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The United States has 234 golf courses that we pay for around the world on some of our overseas installations. When you look at our 800 military bases and major installations around the world, many of them, as you know, are mini cities, right? With Burger King, Starbucks, and really a lot of the amenities of United States life, including golf courses. Had a chance to go down south with some family on my wife's side and was just shocked to see some of the bases we ran into there. One of my relatives was in the military, and saw some golf courses there too. Overseas military bases alone is about $101 billion. Military budget last year was about $680 billion. China's second in the world. They're spending about $180 billion. Somebody said $1.9 trillion for global military spending. Our country alone is about 40% of that. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this time when they had the Cold War, and both countries were spending more than $100 billion. And there was a thought that we'd have a peace dividend, that there'd be a chance where the United States would just sort of calm down, or maybe just take an Advil and relax a little bit with its global military presence and permanent war economy. And I was sitting with a good friend of mine from South Africa. We were actually in the anti-apartheid movement. And George Bush was on an aircraft carrier, and he said, "Now we have a new world order. What we say goes." 4 words, what we say goes. And I looked at my friend, I said, "We're in for a ride. This is going to be interesting." Russian Federation today spends about $70 billion. They have become at least more of a normal nation. And we, of course, have gone in an entirely different direction. Your average tax bill in the United States is $14,000. $4,000 of that will go to the Pentagon. About $1,600 of that, all by itself, will go to weapons contractors. Last year, Lockheed Martin received a check for $48 billion from you and me. I was going to ask the audience, did anybody in here get a check from the U.S. Treasury from $48 billion? I mean, I would even take it in increments. I mean, that would work. But we could actually do a lot to deal with climate change. But yeah, Lockheed Martin is the largest weapons contractor in the world. Of course, Eisenhower told us, not only did he talk about the military-industrial republic and his fear of it destroying the republic, but he also said that every missile fired is a theft for those who hunger, and the other things that we could be using our power for. One temptation for any president is that our national media tends to view any act of violence by our country as acceptable. The word war crime or war criminals is absent from our lexicon, for example. Of course, we know that the language of war and militarism is completely euthanized. I love the term airstrike for bombing. NPR lately doesn't even say airstrike, they just say strike. I mean, think of how that sounds to your ears. The United States bombed Iran, or the United States launched airstrikes on Iran. So the Orwellian language that the Pentagon uses is just picked up by journalists who just faithfully repeat it to us, and it makes war a lot easier. We don't even call it the invasion of Iraq, we call it the war in Iraq. Can you imagine if you went to Germany today, they didn't call it the invasion of Poland, they called it the war in Poland. Our language is so sanitized. Martin Luther King Jr., one of his many warnings was that a country that continues to spend more on war than on people will experience a spiritual death. We don't spend a lot of time reflecting on spiritual death and what it actually means. The last thing I'll end with, since this is an educational event, is there's a saying, freedom isn't free. And I think that's an interesting phrase. I think that would come as news to the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who said that you're actually born free. You're born with certain inalienable rights. I'll actually give you a different definition of freedom. James Madison, who didn't get everything right, there's so many holes in the Constitution, but James Madison said something interesting. He had his own definition of freedom was a people cannot exist both ignorant and free. So I hope as a people maybe we think of that definition of freedom someday and move away from a state of perpetual war to some sort of civilian economy and become more of a normal nation. Thank you.
Next is David Hempel. David is Vice President of the local chapter 161 of Veterans for Peace. Sorry. Sorry, go ahead. Anthony Robinson is next. Totally disorganized, never trust the moderator. Anthony is the Communications and Outreach Coordinator of Peace Iowa and a member of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Sorry, I apologize.
Our next president will need to face a body of constituents living in states with economies that are boosted by either military bases or corporations that operate somewhere in the military-industrial chain. This president will have to work with a Congress that faces strong pressures from lobbyists and super PACs representing the interests of powerful defense contractors. As the leader of a nation that is itself a leader in global affairs, how could our next president raise national and global consciousness to put war and business in a healthy perspective?
Okay, wow, yeah, if I was president, yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that possibly is a way you could speak to people who think only in the religion of money and capitalism is to speak to them in the realm of the civilian infrastructure that has come from the Pentagon system. I mean, nearly everything on your touch phone was created by the Defense Department. The satellite system, microwaves, the internet. So really this has been already a system of what Noam Chomsky calls public subsidy and private profit. And so if you could convince people that you could move this out of some kind of a Defense Department and think of it in terms of infrastructure, and it could be created for something other than the means of killing people, then you could have the kind of Green New Deal and all the other things we're talking about in terms of the climate, just generating this, being more honest about building this infrastructure for, maintaining human life rather than destroying it.
Okay. Next, we're going to have Aaron Page, who is going to talk to us a little bit about multilateral alliances and human rights. Aaron is with the Center for Human Rights. He's a university professor at the University of Iowa. Aaron, go get him.
Thank you. Am I allowed to stay seated, Mr. Moderator? All right, thank you. I'll be more comfortable and I won't realize how badly I have to go to the bathroom. Okay, so yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about human rights, multilateralism. I think share the topic of the UN a little bit with some fellow panelists in this discussion that we've already had, which has really been amazing. I think, I'd like to begin by reflecting on the fact, not only what we've already heard here today, but the fact that we're at an event that was titled the U.S. Role in an Interdependent World, and the people who came here are probably, interested in that topic. And, to some extent, the question of should we engage with the UN and take a multilateral approach. I don't want to take it for a given, but I think there's a lot of support for that. And I think we've heard a lot of the reasons why that's important. So it is important. I'm going to want to discuss for a little bit more detail what the UN, is. It's not a single thing, the different pieces of it. But when I say that, I also want to reflect on the fact that, we've been here before. Very strong calls for international cooperation are nothing new. And, if we look at the last century, there have been times where, potentially the calls have been just as great or greater. And, within our own time, a lot of us in this room have been working on this issue and trying to get a different type of approach for a very, very long time. And there have been some successes, and there's been a lot of difficulty getting traction on this message. And I think I want to take very seriously the question of why. You know, how is it that we're talking about this, and what is standing in the way of getting to the kinds of relationships that we want to have around the world, and the way that we want to work in the world? Okay, and I think that also sort of will, to some degree. Now I'm going to bring a law professor kind of perspective on it, but to some degree, I want to focus on the obstacles that any of these candidates who either came in here or would come in here and would say, yes, absolutely, I want to take a multilateral approach, I want to cooperate, I want to work with the UN is very important. What are the obstacles that they're going to face when they get out of the primary, okay, when they get into the general election, when they start going up for debates against a Republican candidate, and when they get into the Oval Office, and when they actually have to start garnering support and governing? What are the kinds of obstacles that they're going to face when they encounter this? And you know, we know these, and they're deep, and they're profound, and they're difficult. And I do want to call them out a little bit. And at the heart of it, right, is this idea of American exceptionalism. And this is a concept that on the one hand is easy to ridicule. You know, the idea that we're some sort of a special nation, that we just follow our own rules, that we're the first. Just looking, we're one nation among many nations. We're the present superpower, historically following a series of other empires and superpowers. What is it that's quite so exceptional about us? And yet it's something that a lot of us can know that and also feel something about that at the same time, and we can see that working in the political discourse and see the appeal of that and see how it's leveraged very successfully. There's an idea of a hegemonic prerogative. Okay, we're the most powerful nation. We're entitled to break the rules. We're entitled to redefine the rules. And that's not just a feeling sort of in certain parts of the public. That's actually built into the international legal system in ways. And there are legal scholars, and there are certainly political factions that talk about international law itself as having a soft character, not being very binding, a tenuous net of breakable obligations. And it usually leans towards the idea that the most powerful nation doesn't need to be, it can follow the international law when it's in its interests, but if it needs to break the law and act in its own way, in a way it's entitled to do it. And there are historical examples of that, of course, but that becomes in a sense, an actual interest. And the way that we frame the national interest, okay, the phrase the national interest, and how politicians talk about it, and the way it's framed out is basically what we want right now, our view of this particular situation, and our self-interest, and is not typically discussed in any way that has the capacity to recognize that we may have longer-term interests, that it may be at times to approach the very difficult task of saying, maybe it's important to actually not get our way on this particular issue if it creates a culture of cooperation and compliance that is stronger in the future, that creates a stronger global community. With respect to human rights, which is sort of my specialty, there's a strong sense of provincialism in the way that we see these things, right? So the UN contains lots of different human rights bodies that their purpose is essentially to review state action, to go into state policies, to see state conduct, and to challenge what is out of compliance with international human rights norms. And it's an intentional violation of sovereignty. And that does not sit well with a lot of the American public. And it's a very difficult issue that is out there that again, with all these things, what I'm going to be calling for in a second is a closer look at how do we talk about this? How are we going to engage people to engage our politics to address these issues more carefully? And not only do we get prickly at the idea of international agencies reviewing what we're doing, reviewing what our courts are doing, what our administrations are doing, there's also a provincialism in considering that it even matters. One of the phrases I just heard today that I recognize that is that, we're succeeding because we're out there talking to voters and the issues that matter to them. I hear in that some sort of a code word that, some of these issues that are global issues, those aren't the ones that matter to voters, or those aren't the issues that voters perceive matter to them. And so changing the conversation so that voters get that these issues do matter to them in a deeper way. And then finally, I think there's politics around the idea of a global anti-regulatory politics, so the global nanny state, right? And just importing kind of the politics around Brexit, for example. And you can kind of see, Democratic candidates or candidates that really want to push international cooperations are going to face this. They're going to face a counter politics of people saying, no, we don't want to listen to the UN and Geneva telling us what to do. We need local politicians. We need our own government doing things, right? And telling us what to do through our elected officials, and bringing basically a democratic type argument to bear on that. So these are all the types of brands of politics that our politicians are really going to face when they go out there to do multilateralism. It's not going to be easy. Okay, and I thought I would sort of, law professor style, tease out a couple examples just to sort of maybe get you to think about how difficult it is, right? Imagine the ICC decides that it wants to issue an international arrest warrant for Eddie Gallagher, for the Navy SEAL who was pardoned by Trump and acquitted by a U.S. jury, saying that trial was biased and he committed war crimes at an international level and has not been held to account. There's jurisdiction because he was acting international, and he needs, like this American citizen, this American soldier needs to be brought to court at the International Criminal Court, right? A democratic president, I want us to start thinking about what the politics are going to be involved. How are we going to get a Democrat to talk about multilateralism and to talk about cooperating with international institutions in the political environment that we can imagine that would create, okay? Or the example that like a human rights body, for example, comes out with a report saying that the U.S. practice of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons is cruel and unusual punishment under international human rights standards and needs to be abolished. And the politics domestic politics that are going to be faced with that, they're going to come back and say, well, you can't have, this is an issue of U.S. constitutional law. We have our own interpretation of this. This is a matter of state-by-state interpretation, or local officials, or the dangerousness, the need of this for crimes, or even for prison security. There's going to be lots of different issues. So I'm just these are examples where I'm trying to show how this is going to be a difficult political task to confront. And these kinds of things are going to come up at debates. And typically my impression is that Democrats get bullied on this. And we try to find different ways to bring multilateralism into the existing framework of a short-term national interest, of American exceptionalism. One of the famous examples of this is that we're going to try to lead, but we're going to lead using soft power instead, or smart power, right? These other types of things. We're not really challenging we're not really changing the political language that we use to talk about multilateralism. We're just we're nibbling around the edges, okay? And so what would it mean? And I don't have any questioners lined up, so I'm going to need other people either on the stage or you guys to help with me in thinking about this now, or as we go forward. What kind of language, the question that I basically asked for myself is, how do we develop a political language for the type of interdependence that we know is necessary, that resonates broadly with the American public, okay, outside of the primary audience, okay, with the general audience, and starts to change these deep ideological barriers, okay? And so American exceptionalism, why exceptionalism, to some extent what we're talking about is American uniqueness. Yes, we're exceptional. Yes, we're unique. Guess what? All nations are unique, and in a way we can celebrate our uniqueness and we can celebrate our victories without saying that we don't have to follow the rules, right? And we can look to different historical models about how hegemonic military, hegemonic powers have operated. It's not, there isn't a single one-size-fits-all model. Human rights is a very strong language that I think candidates are starting to use, right? Because not just because of the international human rights law, but because it does connect us to this basic notion that human right, that humans matter, okay, that non-US lives matter, which is actually, to some degree, a complicated, difficult thing to start talking about in larger politics environment, and lots of different ways of talking about the national interest. So I think there are ways of creating a new language, really engaging these deep ideological barriers, but I think it starts by really identifying them, calling them out for what they are, and beginning trying to begin a conversation about what we're facing. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start with a comment, if I might. I think the argument that we have to do more than apologize for the positions that we hold, that we have to, in some sense, reframe the debate, is something that I'm very familiar with in the nuclear sphere. In the nuclear debate, if you argue on the terms that are set by the current experts and government officials who've all been to the same grad schools and learned all the same assumptions, you can't get to elimination of nuclear weapons. You will have bought into a set of assumptions that predetermine the answer. And so I agree that one of the fundamental things that has to be done on some of these important issues is to think about how to state the case boldly. There's a marvelous video, you can watch it online, of, or maybe it's just the audio, of President Kennedy improvising the last 4 minutes of his address on civil rights on a national television speech. They didn't get the speech written in time, and he just supposedly did the last little bit from out of his head. And civil rights was a very difficult issue in 1962 or 3 when he was giving this speech, a very touchy issue. And to watch him step forward and say, we have to do this because it is right, and here are the reasons, and here's why you want to care about this, and here's why you agree that it's right. And to watch the boldness with which he steps into this difficult and, challenged issue is inspiring. So I agree.
Yeah, well, I'll just follow up and say I agree, absolutely. And I would just add that, what we're talking about here, in a sense, is courage, okay? The courage to be bold and to stand back for it. And that, courage isn't something you get when someone wags their finger at you, be more courageous. It is something we build as a community. And that's what we got to be doing. And the ways of, you mentioned, we do it through media. We'll do it through films. We do it through protests. We do it in lots of different ways. But it's a collective act, and that's what I think we really need to focus on.
I agree. Question,
Claudia. Yeah.
One of the first things that we need to do as a country on multinationalism on the world stage is to begin to address it in our country, because our country is changing, and we are becoming a multinational country, and our demographics are changing everywhere, including tiny pockets in Iowa. And once we can engage the public consciousness in our country, we don't have to wait for that, mind you, but to do that in a really serious and committed way on every domain, in school, in business, in law, in defense, whatever domain it is, but to step that up in our own country, I think is at least a precedent to doing it abroad.
Absolutely.
So let's do our last expert, and then we'll have a little time to expand and talk, have some questions, and then we'll close. So last is Jim Olson. Last but not least, he's president of the Johnson County United Nations Association and worked for 15 years at the national offices of the United Nations Association. He's going to talk about UN agencies and functions, and then we're going to have some time to talk.
So thank you, Ward. One of the interesting things about being the last speaker is that there's just a temptation to say, I agree, and sit down. And I do agree. This has been a very rich discussion. I want to thank the organizers, especially Maureen. Yes, you should run for Congress. I completely agree. Thank you for thank you for sitting here in this not warm room and listening to us and sharing your perspectives. I want to say that I thought that Aaron's presentation was quite provocative. I think we do indeed need to change the language and how we talk about these issues. I have some faith that through a combination of pragmatism and idealism, we can find the language that will break through the deadlock on these issues. I'm going to say a little bit about the UN, and what my presentation is quite factual, but I think it's important to talk about why the UN is important, and then loop around to the topic of how does the U.S. provide more leadership and more constructive leadership than it has presently. So the UN is marking its 75th anniversary this year. It has quadrupled in size from the original 51 members to currently 193 sovereign, feisty nations who all have their own interest, but nevertheless have come together to try to address issues which they cannot resolve on their own. Issues like climate, global health, migration, protection of the planet. They do this not so much out of altruism, perhaps not at all out of altruism, but rather out of a sense that only by working together can they make some progress. Sometimes they do work together, many times they do not. The UN is nothing more really than the will of its 193 members. The UN provides a forum, a space, a mechanism for them to work together if they want. And if they don't want to, nothing will happen. The UN has been deeply involved in the issues we've been talking about today. Been talking about climate change. The UN does three things in the area of climate action. First, it assembles worldwide scientific information on climate. Reference has been made today to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is a UN body. It issues reports based on scientific work that's gathered from around the world. The UN provides a forum for nations to negotiate. We've made reference also to the Paris Climate Agreement that was negotiated within the framework of the UN. And then thirdly, the UN helps countries and people who are the most adversely affected by climate change to try to cope with that situation. The UN also provides alternatives to war. Many examples I could cite, but I'll just limit myself to one. The UN is the only place where there's some diplomatic effort underway to try to resolve the very serious civil war in Yemen, the most profound humanitarian crisis in the world today. It's very tough going. The UN has been involved in efforts to advance nuclear disarmament. Ward made reference to the effort to try to negotiate a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. If you go back in the history of the UN, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of the foundations of efforts to try to deal with nuclear arms, was also negotiated within the framework of the UN during the 1960s. The UN is involved in efforts to protect the environment. Currently, the UN is involved in promoting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I was counting, and at least 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals actually deal directly with environment. One is clean water and sanitation. A second is affordable and clean energy. A third is life below water. And the fourth is life on land. But beyond that, the UN is working to address the root causes of war and conflict and oppression, addressing poverty, violations of human rights, and ignorance. My little remarks are titled The Work of UN Agencies. Let me just mention a few examples. The mortality rate from childhood diseases has been reduced drastically, thanks in large part to the work of UN agencies. The UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, vaccinates 40% of the world's children against infectious diseases. Asher Omar mentioned the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That's dirty, unglamorous work trying to assist the 73 million forcibly displaced people around the world. This week, we've been hearing a lot about the coronavirus in China, which is now spreading elsewhere. It's a UN agency, the World Health Organization, that's trying to coordinate international efforts to deal with that outbreak. The UN has a record of achievement. It also has a huge unmet agenda. It is fragile. It is underfinanced. The US, as we've heard, has pulled back or pulled out. I want to end with a hopeful note. How many of you think that the UN is still a useful institution after 75 years? And I think most of you are raising your hand. That is a majority opinion. Public opinion polls show that 8 out of 10 Americans agree that the UN, after 75 years, still is a useful institution. Our organization, the UN Association, worked with a Hawkeye poll here in Iowa, and Iowans also agree. This is not a minority opinion, it is a majority opinion, and that gives us something to work with. For 3 years, the Trump administration has submitted budget requests to the Congress which would slash funding for the UN, and all through 3 years, Congress has restored that funding. The Trump administration wants to zero out US financial support for UNICEF altogether. Congress has resisted that. And why? I think there's some sort of underlying sense in Congress that actually U.S. membership and U.S. leadership and U.S. financial support for the UN is both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. And I think that that gives us something to work with. Our elected officials and candidates don't hear much about the UN. It's not a top-tier issue. But if we verbalize it, we can show that there is, in fact, a constituency here in Iowa and around the country that demands that the United States, as one of the UN's charter members, as a permanent member of the Security Council, as the host to UN headquarters, wants this country to work with others to give constructive leadership. So maybe during the question period, I could address what I would advise a new president to do. But I thought it was important to talk about why the UN is worthy, continues to be worthy of support. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes. You have questions, I can tell. Who would like to ask a question? Yes, you. Get ready with your question. Think about what you're going to ask. You can ask anyone on this stage and anyone in the audience, or if you just would like to say, I feel emotional about this, or this matters to me. Not at great length, but a little, please.
A short one, probably mostly for Jim, but for anybody. The Iowa City is the first U.S. UNESCO City of Literature. The U.S. pulled out of UNESCO. You know, both tragic and ironic, I think. Shouldn't an effort to rejoin UNESCO come from Iowa?
Sure, I think that's a great idea. Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay, all the way in the back again. Here we go. There's no point wasting time watching me walk.
Now I should come up to you. Okay, I've been hearing so many great things. This is a really good program. I want to give kudos to all of you who put this together. It's super professional and informative, and I'm so grateful we could be here for part of it. I guess the theme, I'm a teacher, and when I hear all these things about what's going on in our country and our world and that we participate in all of it, I just wonder about our literacy around peace. I feel like we struggle with peace illiteracy. And if I asked my students to name 5 generals, 90% of them can do it. If I asked them to name 5 pacifists, I don't know if a single one hand would come up. And I think I heard Weiss, was that your name? You do peace studies, and I'm wondering, how do we get that into our curriculum? You know, our kids, when they watch TV, I think 83% of their shows have violent themes. Their video games have violent themes. We're indoctrinated into this ethic of violence, and we have overwhelming confidence in the ethic of violence, that it's the strategy for everything with our foreign policy. We don't know anything but violence, and how do we change that? So how do we bring peace literacy to America?
She's asking you, Jeff.
If I was advising the president. I don't actually teach peace studies, I teach political science. But I teach peace studies subversively, because one of the problems we have in education, which many of you know, is we fragment political science over here, economics over here, history over here. And so the historians leave slavery to the historians, leave supply and demand to the economists, et cetera. But I think whatever you're teaching, just work it into your curriculum. I mean, there's certain things in political science, like the study of US government. I do a PowerPoint, The Road to the Civil War, because I know that if I don't do it, they're not going to understand that part of history and how it shaped the US government and the US economy. So I would just say, work it into your curricula.
How do we make it not submersive? I don't have friendly administration. That won't work for me.
How do you make it what not work?
Not submersive. How do we make it, systemically create like peace studies? Like, I know we've got ROTC in so many campuses, and a friend of mine, I don't know if you know Coleman McCarthy, he calls it like a prostitution ring, where kids have to join the military to get their education, right?
Yeah.
So we have ROTC all over our high school, or JROTC in our high schools, we have ROTC in our universities. How do we get peace studies into our high schools, our junior highs, our universities? How do we get systemic education where it's not, you know, rogue teaching? Where
is it high school?
Junior high.
Junior high, shoot. I was going to say, if it was a high school, one thing you could do is you could tell the school that they might be breaking the law if they don't let students know that they can opt out of having their information being sent to military recruiters and things like that. I mean, but junior high, I mean, once again, I don't know, we're not going to tell you how to teach, but I would just say, work it in. I can't imagine that it would be a problem to talk about Frederick Douglass and in the history of the country. Yeah, but
okay.
Maybe you can give her a better answer for people up here. Yeah.
Anybody else have an answer?
And maybe say something about, I guess, the concept of peace is important. China has been building and have not gone into wars for the last 2 decades, and they are going to surpass us as an economic power. And that is very important for our country to know that the Soviet Union collapsed under their own weight without fighting a war. And they were building their military, and that's what we are doing now. And China is building their economy, and it's a matter of fact that they are going to surpass us. The 7 emerging economies are bigger than the 7 biggest economies right now, and we have to live in a world where we have to be dealing with each other in a respectful way.
Good answer. Yeah. You haven't asked a question. Great.
Yeah. I like what you said about, I like what some people said about the threat of nuclear weapons, whatever. There's really a situation in a part of the world I'm really concerned about. The situation between India and Pakistan is really dangerous, and Kashmir's been put under, I don't know, martial law or lockdown. They were self-governing, and I don't know if anybody wants to address that, what we could do as a nation or the UN could do to resolve the situation between India and Pakistan, because a nuclear war between those 2 countries would be disastrous for the whole world. So,
great question. Okay, all right. I had a point on India, Pakistan. I cut it for time. You're exactly right. There's deep-seated animosity between Pakistan and India. They are divided by religion. They're divided by culture. There are severe problems in the future, and this is a good example of how all these issues are connected. It is predicted by the Climate Change Committee of the UN that the snow and ice in the mountains that melt and supply 75% of the water to Pakistan's agriculture will be halved by 2035. So by 2035, Pakistan will have half as much water to grow the crops that they need to feed their population. And the other problem is that the 5 rivers that separate and come down from those glaciers, some of them flow across the border into India and then back into Pakistan and across the border into India. And so almost as soon as there's a less water available, people are going to start damming up the river on their side of the border. So it's a very serious problem, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I think one way to address it, as I said before, is to devalue nuclear weapons, to do no first use, which makes nuclear weapons seem less prominent. Then the fact is, the world still looks to the United States. And if we set the example that nuclear weapons are less important to us, less prominent in our foreign policy, that we're going to get rid of them as soon as we can, that then causes other countries, I think, to downplay them as well. Yes?
Ward, can I answer a couple of questions?
Yes.
I just want to do it real quick because before I forget it, because I am an old woman. From Aaron, I just wanted to say what makes me feel hopeful about changing the language are when the young people stand up, when Greta stands up, when the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas students stand up and they hear some of this crap and they go, that's bullshit. And BS, she says, she's very polite. That's BS. So our hope is that some of the young people are getting the message. But for those who aren't, I was just speaking at West High the other day about Martin Luther King Day, and I remember to tell people that there are such things you can actually go to on the web that are called peace literacy. And they have whole curriculums for high school and younger students. So just look up peace literacy. There's a couple of different organizations that provide real language. And the other thing is that here we have parents and grandparents and younger people even in the audience, although it's thinning out a wee bit. But they are the people, hi James, who are going to take on the messages to the future generations. And then with regard to India and Pakistan, it also brought back a thought that Aaron was bringing to mind, is this notion that we as people in a nation, when we only identify ourselves as members of a nation and not of the globe, is that our culture, our language, does develop a form of exceptionalism. I don't know that India and Pakistan, they talk about exceptionalism, but their whole identity is tied up in their strength, and their strength is represented by their nuclear arsenals. And they actually feel that they could use them as a sign of their strength, as a sign of their role in the world stage. And so I think these issues that we're talking about are not just to the US, but are to the kind of mindset of powerful people that actually permeate the culture, and that those of us who live in these nations have to recognize we are brothers and sisters, we are members of the same family. We are all one species. We are the human race, and that we have to change our language and use our language also as models when we go out there. And I'm sure I had something else to say, but somebody else can talk.
I think we're done.
Are we done?
Do you want to close us? Do you want to say one quick thing?
Well, I would just shout out to Greta as well. And just like the role of youth is incredibly important, has been historically. Look at how, you know, people are trying to delegitimize her and her voices and say, oh, you know, we don't have to pay attention to her. She doesn't have a college degree and various other things. That's not the point here. She is speaking very powerfully, and I think I just really want to, we all want to see that continue. And so absolutely to the young people in the audience and the thousands of them watching this on live stream, keep going. Do not take the little insults inside. Do not get pushed off the stage. You are making a difference, and please, please keep going with that.
Go ahead. I'll do the
but
closing.
I know what I'll just say one last little thing was in terms of language, and this is what I did at West High and what I tried to do with my own students who actually asked for peace studies courses, is to have them take a mental exercise of understanding security. We use that word security so freely, and it has become so embedded in our notion of military. But really, I don't care how secure you are and your goods are, because the policemen are on every corner and the cameras are watching you. If you don't have food, you are not secure. If you don't have a place to go home, you are not secure. If you can't depend on the weather to help your garden, you are not secure. So let's also just start re-examining that notion of security and putting it in a different frame. I think that also helps moving forward. But anyway, you were going to be closing.
Okay. I want to thank everyone who came. I'm really impressed. This is a long event, and you have enormous discipline and determination. So thank you all. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming and participating. I also appreciate that the disagreement or comments were polite and well framed and well discussed. I want to thank all the experts who were very interesting to listen to, each of whom had interesting points to make. I was impressed at the way that the issues seemed to weave together as the afternoon went along, and the points of connection emerged between these different sets of comments. I want to thank our questioners who have been very patient and got to do very little as part of this. So please thank the questioners who worked on their questions beforehand. And last, I'd just like to close. Oh yes, and please, if you've written down questions, give them to us. We would love to know what you thought that you didn't get a chance to ask. You can leave them on the back, in the back. I just want to leave you with this thought. Some years ago, a candidate who came to Iowa spent long hours talking to Iowans about issues that matter, and eventually found he liked Iowans, and they liked him. And he was inspired by Iowans. And on the night of the Iowa caucuses that year, he was moved and said, "Hope is the bedrock of this nation. The belief that our destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by all those men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be." He had been changed by his time in Iowa. The lesson he took away from this state, he said, was the belief that in the face of seemingly impossible odds, people who love this country can change it. Thank you very much.